Good morning, friends. Today I introduce you the most important French philosopher of the 20th century, Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser was born on 16 October 1918 in French Algeria in the town of Barmedrias near Algiers to a small middle-class family from Alsace, France. His father was Charles Joseph Althusser, was a lieutenant officer in the French army, and his mother, Lucine Marthe Berger, was a devout Christian, and she worked for children. She was a teacher. According to his own memoirs, in Algerian childhood was prosperous, as historian says. He is to be placed among the most important intellectuals like Albert Camus and Jacques Derrida, and he is said to be the product of French colonial culture in northern Africa. In 1930, his family moved to French city of Marseilles, as his father was to be the director of Compagnie Algérienne des Banques, Algerian banking company in the city. Althusser spent the rest of his childhood there, excelling in his studies at the Lycée Saint Charles and joining a scout group. A second displacement happened in 1936 when Althusser settled in Lyon as a student of Lycée du Parc. Later he was accepted by the highly regarded higher education establishment Grande École Normale Supérieure ENF in Paris. At the Lycée du Parc, Althusser was influenced by Catholic professors, joined the Catholic youth movement Jeunesse Étudiante Chrétienne, and wanted to be a Trappist. His interest in Catholicism coexisted with his communist ideology, and some critics argue that his early Catholic introduction affected the way he interpreted Karl Marx. After 2 years period of preparation, Kang under Jean Guiton at Lycée du Parc, Althusser was admitted into the ENS in July 1939, but his attendance was deferred by many years because he was drafted to the French army in September in Second World War. Like most of the French soldiers, and Marseilles was the place was captured by the Germans at the end of the Second World War. He was seized in Venice in June 1940. He became a prisoner of war in Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. For 5 years, he remained in the camp. There he was at first drafted to hard labor, but ultimately reassigned to work in the infirmary after falling ill. The second occupation allowed him to read more and more philosophy and literature. In his memoir, he says, "It was in the prison camp that I first heard Marxism discussed by a Parisian lawyer in transit, and I actually met a communist." His experience in the camp also affected in his lifelong bouts of mental instability, reflected in constant depression that lasted until the end of life. Althusser resumed He studies as ENS in 1945 to prepare himself for aggregation, an exam to teach philosophy in secondary schools. In 1946, he met sociologist Helene Rittmann, a Jewish former French resistance member with whom he was in relationship until he killed her by strangulation in 1980. That same year, he started a close, friendly relationship with Jacques Martin, a G.W.F. Hegel, and Hermann Hesse, a translator who later committed suicide and to whom Althusser dedicated his first book. Martin was influential on Althusser's interest on reading the bibliography of Jean Cavallis, Georges Cognilhem, and Hegel. Although Althusser remained a Catholic, he became more associated with left-wing groups when joining the workers' peace movement and embracing the synthesis of Christian and Marxist thought. This combination may have led him to adopt German idealism and Hegelian thought, as it did Martin's influence and a renewed interest on Hegel in the 1930s and 40s in France. In consonance, Althusser's master thesis to obtain his diploma, the Etudes Supérieures, was on content in the thought of G.W.F. Hegel. Du contenu dans la pensée de G.W.F. Hegel, 1947, based on the phenomenology of spirit and under Gaston Bachelard's supervision. Althusser dissertated on how Marxist philosophy refused to withdraw from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. According to researcher Gregory Elliott, Althusser was Hegelian at that time, but only for a short period. And he joined in 1948. He was proved to teach in secondary schools, but instead made a tutor at the ENS to help the students to prepare for their aggregation. His performance on the exam, he was the best ranked on the writing part and second on the oral module, and guaranteed this change in his occupation. He was responsible for offering special courses and tutorials on particular topics and particular figures from the history of Western philosophy. In 1954, he became Secrétaire de l'École littéraire, secretary of the literary school, assuming responsibilities for management and direction of the school. Althusser was deeply influential at the ENS because of the lectures and conferences he organized, in particular leading French philosophers such as Gilles Deleuze and Jacques Lacan. He also influenced a generation of French philosophers and French philosophy in general. Derrida, Pierre Bourdieu, Michel Foucault, and Michel Sartre were all his students. And he worked for 35 years in ENS till November 1980. The most famous essay is Ideological Status Apparatus. This is a main contribution to his study of the nature of the state and its approach to the administration of the subjects. Because Althusser held that a person's desires, choices, intentions, preferences, judgments, and so forth are the effects of social practices. He believed it necessary to conceive of how society makes an individual in its own image. Within the capitalistic societies, the human individual is generally regarded as a subject, a self-conscious, responsible agent, whose actions can be explained by his or her beliefs and thoughts. For Althusser, a person's capacity to perceive himself or herself in this way is not an innate. Rather, it is acquired within the structure of the established social practices which impose on individual the role of ferment of the subject. Social practices both determine the characteristics of the individual and give him an idea of the range of properties that he can have and of limits of each individual. He argues that many of our roles and activities were given to us by social practice. For example, the production of steel workers is a part of economic practice, while the production of lawyers is a part of political legal service. However, other characteristics of individual, such as their beliefs about the good life, on their metaphysical reflections on the nature of self, and do not easily fit into these categories. In Althusser's view, our values and desires, preferences are inculcated in us by ideological practice, the sphere which has a definitely defining property of constituting individuals as subjects. Ideological practice consists of an assortment of institutions called ideological state apparatus, ISA, which include the family, media, religious organizations, and most importantly in capitalist society, the education system, as well as the received ideas that they propagate. No single ISA produces in us the belief that we are self-conscious agents, and to derive this belief in the course of learning, and it is to be a daughter, a school child, a bank, a steel worker, a doctor, a counselor, an engineer, and so forth. Despite its institutional forms, the functional structure of ideology is unchanging and present throughout history. Althusser states, ideology has no history. All ideologies constitute a subject, even though he may differ according to each particular ideology. Memorably, Althusser illustrates this with the concept of hailing and interpellation. He compares ideology to a policeman shouting, "Hey, you there!" toward a person walking on the street. Upon hearing this call, the person responds by turning round, and in doing so is transformed into a subject. The person being hailed recognizes himself and herself as the subject of the hail and knows to respond. Althusser called this recognition as misrecognition, chronogynes, because it works retroactively. A material individual is always ready an ideological subject even before he or she is born. The transformation of the individual into a subject has already happened. Althusser acknowledged the debt to Spinoza's theory of immanence. And he also speaks of IRSA, the repressive apparatus used by the state authority whenever there is a breakout of the violence by the working class. To highlight this, Althusser offers the example of Christian religious ideology embodied in the voice of God, instructing a person on what his place in the world is and what he must do to be reconciled in the Christ. And from this, Althusser draws the point that in order for that person to identify as a Christian, he must first already be a subject. That's by responding to God's call and following his rules. He affirms himself as a free agent, the author of acts for which he assumes responsibility. We cannot recognize ourselves outside the ideology, and in fact our very actions reach out to the overreaching structure. Althusser's theory draws heavily on Jacques Lacan and his concept of a mirror stage. We acquire our identities by seeing ourselves mirrored in ideology, and this is a gist of is one of the main contributions to 20th century criticism. I must conclude by saying that he died on 22 October 1990 at La Virera, France.